right. Excellent. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky Inspired series that we do in collaboration with Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. It is delightful to have Struppi back. Welcome, Struppi. All right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have this conversation with Struppi. We'll do it in 3 parts, I think, 3 or 4 parts. First, we're going to be talking about the story of the 6 spheres. Then you get to ask any questions, make any comments that you have. Then we will go to the idea of spherical time. Again, Struppi will present any comments, any questions. Third, Struppi is going to be talking about his impressions of various meetups. And then I'm going to invite everybody to talk about where they are in their journey of, with Bucky's ideas. And so that's the general plan, but we will modify it as needed. Struppi, does that sound good?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the floor is all yours, Struppi.
Well, all right. Thank you. Thank you all for, hi, Craig, for having gathered again. And it's really, I'm super excited. I've been looking forward to coming back with you all for so long. So a third of a year already. And yeah, I'm just wildly curious about where you all have come to be now. I've been following around the meetups that you were sharing over YouTube, and it's really been a beautiful and very intriguing year so far in terms of all these living ideas. Hi, Richard, also. Yeah, and I thought, as mentioned, and as you can perhaps see from the title of this meetup, that I'd begin with what I call the story of the 6 spheres, which is one storyline among many that I feel are available for us to get a sense of spherical thinking, grasp it, and wrap our minds around that. And it is in some ways a continuation of the first one we did. Although I would rather, I'm gonna have them all close, and this is here just in case we want to remember what the dance of the Tao looked like. But today I'd like to go sphere by sphere, given that we've already sort of come to a place where I hope those who are present get the sense that if I, for instance, show you these 2 spheres and bring them together, that we could now look only at the connection between them as the line of connection, the finger pointing between the 2 hearts of these spheres. And as every finger points both ways, that is a connection that goes 2 ways. And so the when I try to explain to people, tell them the stories, again, this is really more of a storytelling than a lesson. I'm not a teacher. I'm just here to present something that everyone can take a good look at and take to their heart and perhaps find resonance with that. So, as I've explained in the last one. Let me just recap that, anyways. The idea of what a sphere is within synergetics or spherical thinking can be reduced to saying a sphere is a body of a membrane, at minimum a membrane of other systems, other spheres. We're not looking into that too deep now. It's a membrane that is binding as a boundary an inside to an outside, making a hole, because the hole is the hole, not just one side or the other. And by doing so, manifesting a center of gravity in the heart of the sphere. So that is a little more vague even than Bucky's definition of a sphere. He would say that a sphere is a system where the members of the membrane are approximately the same distance from an approximate common center. Lots of approximation in there, because nature, universe does not like to be limited to that kind of precision of it has to be perfect. Nobody is perfect in universe. Yeah, so with that as a common ground to say this is the minimum that we want to identify in a system to be able to say it's a sphere, let's draw the attention to the connections. So I've got here for the means of this presentation, I've got this little ball bearing. It's a little steel ball, high frequency sphere, so high that we can't look through the eyes anymore unless we use radio grammetry or whatever they call them, crystallography. They can still shine a light through the holes, through the ice, but it's gonna be a tiny light. So I've got two of those, and I'm gonna connect them with this here straw with magnets in them, right? So that is the way to say, now we've got two spheres connected, right? And this is the same system as with the two oranges. It's just that in this case, the size of the spheres in this is as big as this finger is long in terms of diameter. All right, so I recognize that we cannot quite see the entire sphere right now because we've reduced it to more or less the center of gravity and the relationship, but the sphere is that big nevertheless. This is very much a presence in the system. Whether we tune into the connection or into the sphere itself, that's the kind of fluidity we get out of synergetics. And with this, I already kind of skipped the fact that a single sphere on its own could not be aware, as Bucky was great to point out. So in Bucky's sense, life comes down to awareness, and awareness implies otherness, because without otherness, there's no awareness, and without awareness, there's no oneness. So to be one self implies and complements one another. So yeah, we've got now our two spheres connected, and so far this is really just going back through what we went through before with the other explanation. I've got now a pair of spheres. They are another set that is a whole because they have a common center of gravity in between them where I can balance this. And we cannot say anything else about their relationship other than it's a linear relationship, which is to say a lot, because a linear relationship, contrary to conventional belief, is not going to infinity. It's not a division. It's very much a definite connection between two. And whether it's a long line or a short line, it's probably not a straight line, because other than in the perfect mind of the Greek geometer, there is no straightness that we could experimentally find in universe in that way. Because something that is really truly as straight as we get is a high tension system. Like if I take a string and pull it tight, then it gets straight. But the string itself is still going in a wave. It's still gonna have that. So keep that in mind. No perfection needed, no straightness here. But nevertheless, we have a compendence this is not a interdependent system, but a compendent system. They both hang together rather than off of one another. All right, that's a lot of saying stuff about a very small thing. So let's add to that and get yet another sphere into the mix. And since these are magnets, I'm going to follow their liking rather than forcing them together the other way. And now we get to this, which is a system of 3, but it's not balanced. It's not completely connected yet. It's allowing for freedom now of movement, because these spheres can basically roll around one another freely. But we do find that this is a system out of balance insofar as there is the one that connects to 2, and those 2 don't connect up with one another. And I guess this is as good a time as any to bring this up, but this was when you had the meetup on the geometry of the drama with Doug. There came up this question between Richard and Doug of how it could be that the triangle, as stated in the presentation, was considered such an unstable system in terms of a social constellation. And I think it really comes down to this, that this kind of constellation is not necessarily a stable one, because there is no connection between all members yet. This can be a very, very violent one indeed. And the one, on one hand, the one in the middle is very much, defined by the other 2, because on these ends of the connections, I have full control over the angle in the middle. But at the same time, the one has, it's in a place where it can also direct the other 2 where they don't know about one another. Yes, so that's, I think, the distinction between the more or less dramatic kind of constellation of 3 and an actual triangulation. Because if we do add the 3rd connection here, which bridges our 2 outsiders of that other connection, we do get a triangle, another whole system with its center of gravity in the middle. This being a system that can hold shape, which is, it is structure. This is structure. Structure is triangle. And it does hold the shape by being a fulcrum on one hand, where at the ends of the levers where I have least effort, I get a 3rd member who holds this link in place, and vice versa. We go all around. So this is essentially the simple-most circle, full circle. And if I did actually take spheres, as in this case, I can show you that they are still able to move, because they can turn in or out, like an involution or evolution, like this one here. So the triangle is still able to move, but it's also able to hold actively its shape. That's a very special, very, very special condition. And it is a plane, no surface. That's why I call this an eye, because I can look through. And the triangle offers for the first time an in-between, not inside and outside yet, but I can look through from the same side to the same side, one side and another. We're going to come back to that when we look into time. All right, and we know that this is a plane because every tripod that we set down sits on the ground, and it's not going to rock and walk away. It can tip over, but it's not going to rock because it's got 3 legs, and therefore, however uneven the ground, it comes with its own plane of existence. All right, that's the triangle. I hope I said everything I want to say about that. And this is a reiteration. I've told this story many a times, but every time it's different, and that's for the better. So let's add a 4th sphere. And for the moment, this is going to be a repetition of the steps before, because for now we have again, just that kind of linear relationship with a free angle between these. Then we do have that one meet yet another sphere, touch that, and we get to the pair of eyes, which is where polyformity really first appears, because we realize that a single eye, when it unfolds, is already going two ways, complementing one another. And it is very much still moving, you know. It's actually not as stable as I wanted it to be, because the magnets have run into the depth of the straws a little too far, so they don't get as much hold of the ball bearings, but it's fine. Still, you can see how this is like a hinge, like a book fly. It can take off like a bird. So when that happens, we have two planes, and now we get our last connection in place, and we get full circle to a sphere again, because we get the first sphere of spheres, the four eyes, where we have inside and outside bound together by a membrane, membered by, in this case, four spheres, and they create their common center of gravity in the middle. This is, you know, in synergetics, the quantum. It's the unit of volume and the minimum system, because really in synergetics terms, a system is equivalent to a body. It's something that has inside and outside, which is funny because I've been calling this thing a system all along the way, but really now it's a full system, whole system again. And mind you, its identity is not just its inside, but its universe. Universe defined by this system, by this membrane, because the membrane is binding the entire inside to the entire outside, and only the whole thing is the whole thing. All right, so lots of synergies along the way, lots of wholenesses that we integrate and bring together. And this is as far as we took it, I think, on the first round. So let me show you what comes now, because this is only 4 out of 6 spheres. All right. And now is the part where we learn another lesson about what synergy is, and we get to meet a quantum leap, but little by little, one by one. Let's add one more sphere. So far, so good. It's, again, the same kind of setup. We first get that free to move kind of linear relationship with an angle in terms of the relationship to the other connections, but nothing else. It's nothing new that we haven't seen yet. So we add yet another connection. Let's see this one, and we get another situation as with the pair of eyes. So we have an edge-bound eye now, so to speak. You know, I call these edges fingers. I said that before. So I guess it's a finger-bound finger-bound eye. Still nothing new. Let's add another one. And with that, we get something interesting, because we get, again, a stable system where everyone is connected. And this is basically one way of having a pair of 4 eyes. We could call it the 6 eyes, because it's 6 eyes on the outside, but it's also 6 around 1, because there's a shared eye on the inside. And this is 5 spheres so far, yeah? And looking at this, I guess it's more or less a rhetorical question to ask, what is the volume of this? Because if we just said that the purple part is a volume of 1, then this is quite clearly a volume of 2. I hope that is as clear as I hope it is to everyone. All right, so that's the 6 eyes. Now, let's get to 6 spheres and at the 6th sphere. And again, we repeat our kind of dance that we had before. First, that single connection, the linear one, growing up into another eye that can blink, perhaps. And then when that meets with the third finger, a third sphere, we get again to a very interesting configuration, which looks like this. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. That's my neighbor. She's having fun. Aha, yeah, there you go, Richard. So this is one 4 eyes removed from what Richard was showing. This is what Bucky called the 3 tetra arc. It's kind of like an arc, I mean, sort of. It's bent. It's 3 4 eyes, hence 3 tetra. It is, I think, the more relevant embodiment of a volume 3 quanta, because we could, you know, if you can recall what I told last time on the nature of the box, the so-called cube. Here's the yellow one, if you can remember that. The volume of the minimum cube that we can embody with this kind of creation stuff that I'm doing here is also volume 3. You know, that's something, but in my eyes, given the relevance of 3 in general and in Fibonacci in particular, I find this a very interesting case, that this is a volume 3. And it is also the seed crystal, so to speak, for a helix that can grow out of this, which is called the tetrahelix for obvious reasons. And I'm going to see if I can fetch a good example of that one that shows the 4 eyes a little more clear than the small one that I had in mind, or in my sight. No, I don't know where it is. All right, I'm going to show you the small one. You're not going to be able necessarily to see how this is the same kind of structure, because this brings in a whole different level of frequency play, and we haven't yet really looked into frequency to begin with. But this is a tetrahelix. It's just to the uninitiated eye, it looks not like tetrahedron or tetra eyes, tetrops. 4 eyes, I call them. Not like those at all, but it is. This is a helix of rock crystal and amethyst 4 eyes. Anyways, I'm taking the round tour here because we have reached 6 spheres, yes. And we have gotten to this. Another way to call it, if we were to count the eyes, on the outside of it, there's 8 eyes. And that might ring a bell, 8 eyes. If we did count the shared inside eyes, it would be 10 already. So I guess it's 8 around 2, perhaps. But this is where I can show you what a quantum leap looks like when we look into synergetics. Because if we counted the numbers of spheres, it's 6, half a dozen. The number of fingers is a dozen. And with that, we could already grow a different kind of 8 eyes. And in fact, this is almost that. It's just a matter of precession, which brings us to another one of those meetups that I wanted to get back into. There's a lot I wanted to add to your conversation on that later on. But just as a practical example of precession at play, let us see what happens if I take the very central finger here, the one that is currently pointing vertically. What happens, would you think, if I take that out? This one here. Let me turn this a little so you get a better sense of the shape. Okay, now I'm getting you confused again. That's good. So I'm going to take this finger and I'm going to take it out and put it in between these two hearts. Okay? Let's see if we can do that all together. Let's disconnect the bottom first. And there it goes. There goes the whole thing. That's what you get with magnets. Okay, I said I wanted to disconnect the bottom. I've got that. I'm going to take out the finger. Just for a second, you see this is the thing without the finger. Now it's not a structure anymore. It's not a closed system. It's not a whole system because it's not omni-triangulated, because one of its eyes is actually four-sided. Not a square, no square here, but it's a four-sided one. So I'm going to balance one eye, one tip on my knee, and take back that finger, and rather than having it go in the way it was here, now we put it in that way, or that way. We'll ask the magnets which way they want. But we bring it in this way, which is, if you follow closely, this is precessional shift by 90 degrees, right? Right angle. And it goes here and it goes there. And now it's a whole system again, which is by now hopefully familiar to you. This is the 8 eyes. And that is a quantum leap. Why? Well, we haven't changed anything about the system in terms of the constituents at all, except for the orientation of one relationship, which we've shifted by means of precession by 90 degrees. But if you recall the volume it had just a second ago, as it was 3 4 eyes connected up, that's a volume 3. However, now the 8 eyes, as we have it here, actually has a volume of 4. So there's a full quantum that just came really out of nowhere. I mean, that's probably nowhere with a K in the beginning, because if you know where it is, it's easy to conjure up. It's not nowhere as in, you know, nobody there. So yeah, I think that is a beautiful way of introducing at least 2 out of the 3 foundational or basic, or however we want to call them, the main 3 sisters of the family of spheres, the 4 eyes, 8 eyes, and dozen 8 eyes. This is 2 of them, including some weird golden siblings on the way in between, Siamese systems. And now we've got to this place, which I left you with on the last call. Kind of, you know, I was so I wanted to tell you a lot about it, but we had to talk a lot about the boxes first, and then I felt like I couldn't really get into this and left you with too much in too little a time. But to me, this is the shape of balance. This is it's like at the heart of everything. Like it's the Tao in one of its stages, but a very balanced central place. Yeah, so that's what I call the story of the 6 spheres, and I speak of it being one way of reanimating geometry, because this is all animate, nothing dead, nothing lifeless, nothing solid about this. Everybody of these members is still moving, just together as one. And it shows, you know, we could not put this together as a box, and it couldn't hold the box. But we can have it this way, and it's going to be something where we allow for synergy to come in. All right, but that's a lot already, and I think that's where I would like to hold the story for a second and just breathe and have you. Oh wait, before just to see what the structure looks like if we do look at the spheres more closely. This is the same system, 6 spheres, as you can see, and this is also an 8 eyes, This is actually 8 eyes on the outside, and on the inside we would find another set of 8 because the lines go that way. Yeah, and okay, one last thought before we open it up is just, in my sense, when I play with the 8 eyes and with these 6 spheres, I want to kind of shift our sense of the system a little, because conventionally, when people look into the closest they get to these structures through conventional geometry, the Platonic solids, as they call them, they call this so-called Platonic solid a octahedron, and they like to put it this way. In almost all visualizations of those so-called Platonic solids, you'll find this one like that, because then it looks a lot like 2 pyramids sitting on one another. It looks a lot like lots of squares, really. And it's fine in terms of space-time to have it this way if it's allowed to spin, because then it would be that way. But if it's allowed to come to rest and sit down as it would on the ground, it would sit like this. And that is a different orientation, right? If we do the same with this looks more like 4 plus 2, right? It's the 4 in the hip and the top and the bottom, which are the axes that it's spinning around. And when it does come to rest, oops, it rests like this. And then it doesn't look so much like a square thing anymore, but really like a triangle sitting on a triangle. It's 3 spheres, 3 sitting on 3. And, you know, that's another one of those things I would like to tap into later with regards to the system that Tom Miller was showing, the natural modular, because there's a lot of ways in which that shows the same kind of shift has taken place in his mind, you know, in his understanding of the nature of these structures. And I'm excited to have seen that and spotted it, and also I'm excited that, you know, there's all these things we can share with one another, because you've really been looking so deep into all of this now, and I've spoken enough for now. I'm more than happy to give the word back to you.
All right. Struppi, thank you so much. The most intriguing comment that you made about the 8 eyes, you thought that it had a kind of a beauty. Now, I've been experimenting with it. Folks, go ahead and type ! to line up for comments and questions. But I'm going to start off this first. So what I did was that I started out with the 4 eyes. And for each of them, for each experimentation, I did it all in 3 forms. So I always started with the spheres, so which is focused on the vertices of it. So this is the 8 eyes for the vertices. Second, ones that focus on the eyes themselves. So when you look at it, you notice the eye. Here you notice the spheres first. And then this part, which is you focus on the edges first. So I played around with it, but I wanted to ask you this question. You know, after spending a lot of time communing with the 4 eyes and then moving to 8 eyes, how is the feel of working with 8 eyes different from working with 4 eyes? Please.
That's a good question. Well, in my case, my way into the center was from the 4 eyes to the dozen 8 eyes, you know, this one, into like small, big, and then center. It's like finding balance is always a bit like that, you know, you tech into it, getting a sense of, oh, I don't need to struggle that much. I have this in the middle. And well, the first thing that really stood out to me, the way that I got into them, is that, again, the general sense of the structure is very much one coming from the squares. And it's one way to think of this. Let me get another one, because the magnet one has already, yeah, let's take this one. The magnet one has dissolved again. Here's one made of wild wood. Now, the conventional way could be saying that it's 3 squares interlocked so that they make this shape. However, when we tie them the way I do here, it turns out that there is actually no connection around the square. The square is an appearance. It's something that the triangles are doing for fun, but it's not the kind of solid thing that we make it out to be. And that was a very deep lesson that it taught me. And then, to me, it's remarkable insofar as the balance it's present in many ways within the structure, right? Because, for instance, the straws I brought together here, they had 2 colors, 6 in one color and 6 in another. And as you know, 6 of them make a 4 eyes. So this is really 2 4 eyes brought together. And just as we can take 1 eye and they grow 4 eyes, 1 plus 1 is 4. In this case, we bring 1 4 eyes plus 1 4 eyes, making 8 eyes. Which, yeah, that's just 2 times 4, but the volume is 4, even though the ingredients only have 2 taken on their own. So there's again a case of synergy. And it is still not as many members as we would need to, for instance, make the 1,008 eyes, right? This is, of course, a brilliant structure. It's really, really big, surprisingly so, because this is, the volume of this is 1,006 and a golden ratio, right? So that's 18 for those not familiar with dozens. 18 quanta, but it's only 5 times the number of members brought together, right? There's a lot of gain in this, but it's also already a lot of members, and this is the structure that is most popular when it comes to synergetics, because this is essentially the basic structure for the so-called geodesic dome, which is, I think, the primary application of synergetics we find in the world, where people make this kind of thing, usually with a higher frequency, and that's a shell that they can put over their box house. And that's my way into synergetics too. But it took me a while to understand that this might not be the go-to shape, to begin with, because it's already a very complex one. Yes, it's very big, but it's so many members already that even if I am using, very inexpensive materials and connections and whatever, they quickly number in a higher place than maybe called for in a given situation, which is why I would rather begin with the 8 eyes as a point of departure, or arrival, if you like, a point of arrival to go, is this the shape that I kind of want, how far can I get with answering a need that I have if I take that shape? So that's something about it that really speaks to me. And another thing about it is that I use these things primarily in a practical sense, right? I'm using these shapes in my day-to-day life to create furniture to live around and on. I'm using these to make containers for whatever I need to contain, and all this, And I can tell you, first of all, a container like a cardboard box that isn't a box, but one of these shapes, very often is much more comfortable to carry, much more easy to embrace and to fathom. That's a plus for me already. Good enough reason to try and to use them. But then I've come to realize that now that I got these two here, I can show you this. If I had these two be cardboard boxes, for instance, right? Now, on this one, of course, it's a very, very voluminous box, very voluminous container. But if I only took one eye as the opening, then, you know, I could only put stuff in that would fit through the eye, and I couldn't necessarily make use of the entire volume. If I open up two, it's a different story. Like this one is actually, it's got two fingers that I can open up, and then it's a big enough opening that, you know, rather big, bulky things fit in. But that kind of sense or recognition leads also to see that in this case here, the relative size of the eye compared to the whole structure is a very different balance, right? So if I wanted to have a box, a container where I have good access to the inside to put big things in and take them out, then this choice might be a better one than the other. And it's still going to be a bigger box than a cube. That's the funny thing, because the cube really has a volume of 3 and this has a volume of 4, right? Well, and then lastly, but let me not go too deep into that now, because perhaps that's something that we can get a little back into a little later. But the 8 eyes also leads to my absolute favorite shape, which is the 2 frequency 8 eyes. And to hold them both next to one another, this is the 2. Right? So this is still an 8 eyes, but it's more spheres.
Mm-hmm.
The frequency in this case, we can see this was 1 because we have 2 spheres, 1 connection, 1 interval, that's 1 frequency. Here we have along the edge 3 spheres, 2 intervals, which is 2 frequency. And if I show you the connections in that, the structure of that, that's my go-to, my personal favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to build this as a house and live in it, you know. I've been using it for a lot of things, and you can see, perhaps now that you know a little about these things, that in the middle of this structure, which on the outside appears to be just an 8 eyes, at the heart of it, we actually have the tau dozen 8 eyes, the vector equilibrium.
Wow.
And actually, I've got a second one here that shows it clearer because I use 2 kinds of spheres, beads for it, right?
Mm.
And that shows that this 8 eyes, and in turn every 8 eyes, encompasses the vector equilibrium. Like, you know, that's like the next thing we find when we raise the frequency, we get to that. And that shows us something about the general shape, because you look at this and you see this front eye here, the big eye, facet eye, is actually now 4, right? Because 2 by 2, 2 times 2 is 4. We call them square numbers, but really they're triangle numbers, right? So 3 by 3, that's 9. 4 by 4 is 1,004. And 6 by 6 is 3 dozen, right? No more square numbers, they're triangle numbers. All right, and in this case, we see that the facet looking at us has 4. But if you shift your focus on the next layer, on this one that I'm holding around here, it's the same as this. And I don't know how clear it is for you, but if I could hand it to you, it would be very clear that this second layer is actually a hex. It's a hexagon. It's 6 around one sphere.
Wow.
And that's a big shape, right? That's, we're not usually used to thinking in shapes in terms of this is big and this is small, which is a problem coming from the boxes because they have one shape to fit all sizes, and you need a big one, you make a big box, small one, small box. If we play with these shapes, then if we want a small shape, a small area, we take a triangle, and we want a big one, we take a hexagon. Still triangles, but a lot more room, right? Because actually the circumference of this is the same. On the 4 eyes we have on the top here, there's 6 fingers going around, right? 6. And on the next layer, there's still 6 going around. Yeah, I don't get that off. Anyways, there's still 6 going around, but they are going around 6 eyes. So that's like a third more area, right? And that is present in every single 8 eyes. So even if we're, if in my environment here, a lot of them come together just, because they're counting in the numbers now. And when they do come together, they find places to fit together like so, where they give room for one another, no problem. And they still kind of embody that hexagonal presence within them in 4 directions, right? In a way, this is a very round sphere, even though it doesn't look the part, right? And yeah, again, there's way more to go down into, but I think those are a few of the main kind of insights that I've got, that I gained from the 8 eyes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great answer. And now I will have to extend this to the second frequency. That's what I'll do tonight. All right. So folks, please go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to make comments or ask questions. This is a back and forth. Would love to hear from all of you. We're going to start with Evanique.
Hi, Struppi. It's so good to see you again.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for that, and I just wanted to note what I saw. When you were demonstrating with all the different spirits, it's like there's a natural flow to it. Like there wasn't a forcefulness, like trying to get a result. You were just letting it happen as you put on the different spheres and you let them connect. And then you just put on the different spheres and let them connect. And if it didn't connect, you just went into a different direction. You didn't force it. And I think, and I'm like an embryo when it comes to Bucky, so I could be wrong about this. But I think Bucky kind of had the same idea of just, seeing how things naturally flow together. Like I noticed in different meetups, and people talking, there's always an element of nature or natural flow that comes when people are talking about Bucky and explaining his ideas and demonstrating how they work. The one of note was Tom when he was talking about the spheres and the space for living, and that he was just operating under a natural spirit, like dome, which was actually, if you think about it, similar to Earth, right? That, it's similar to Earth. Is just like round, and he's not trying to force things together that shouldn't be together. It's kind of like letting that happen, and then like those domes or those structures, those buildings, being great structures for energy conservation, for being a cost, that the cost is really not that much, that it could really house people, and that you could really house people, a lot of people, in what seems like a small space. But if you look at it, like you were looking at the that double 8 eyes, I forget what you said, the technical name.
Dozen 8 eyes. That's
Yes, dozen eight
and
eyes.
8 is 20, right? So the Greek is ikosa, 20. But I've moved from calling it 20 eyes to a dozen and 8, because that to me brings in a lot more of the relationships of it, you know. But
Yeah.
yes, that one.
So he said the dozen and eight eyes, where you could fit more in that space
Mm.
than you think you can. So I just love that. And the second part I was going to talk about was that volume that you just showed. You said if you open one of the sticks, and you have more volume. And so thank you for making science approachable. Uh, thank you for making this approachable, and that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I really, the one thing I would like to add to your observation there, in terms of creating these shapes as structures to live in, you know, in terms of houses and stuff. One thing they bring is integrity, which is completely missing from the normal constructed, manufactured reality that we inhabit so far. Because it's been, you know, the design of the framework is one that chooses to ignore integrity. But these do come with integrity, which is to say, you know, they bring a lot of benefits with them if we allow them to be, right? It's kind of a reciprocity. I allow these pieces, these members, to gather in this shape, and as a kind of gift of reciprocity, they present me with a whole lot of good qualities that I wouldn't necessarily expect of them, but they come with nevertheless. And among them is that this structure is resilient in a way that we're not used to. Like if we were familiar with these and we were creating our habitats around these lines, then nobody would die in case of an earthquake. You know, they wouldn't need to be afraid of the earthquake, because they would just get a bit of a shake a loose, you know, everyone's going like, oh wow, earth is shaky today, you know, and they would go through it, and that's it. The houses wouldn't suffer, nor would the inhabitants of the houses. That's one. And another one is, if I needed to, because the seawater was rising, for instance, I could just put 3 longer legs in here, and then that would allow me to have it sit as high as I needed to. I could also tie it in trees if need be. You know, there's a lot more ways that this can be placed somewhere to be habitable. And lastly, where I think the talk about the volumes is, you know, the most consequential, is where we recognize that the cube that we're used to has a smaller volume while creating more waste and all these other things. It's got a smaller volume than the 8 eyes while having a larger surface. And if we know something about bodies, it is that the body temperature and the ease at which that can be balanced by the body is a direct consequence of the ratio of the volume to the surface area of the body. So, you know, in case we go to the polar regions, we're going to probably find large beings because they have a lot of volume with a relatively small surface that the heat can be exchanged through. And this is really where, you know, we're living in an age of mass extinction and climate change right now because of the manufactured reality that we find ourselves in. Like Bucky's, one of his main ideas, concepts that he kind of calculated all the way through was the dome over Manhattan, where they would place this, I don't know, 1 mile diameter dome over the city of Manhattan. And at that time back then, his calculations showed that even though it's a massive, gigantic thing, the reduction in surface area of that one dome compared to the city underneath it was by 81%. 81%. That's not insignificant. That's like a world-shifting kind of number, because what happens is these cities where all these boxes are placed, that's like having a machine, like an engine, you know, where you have these cooling towers that are meant to get the heat of the engine out into the atmosphere so that the engine doesn't overheat. That's the same thing the city is emulating because of its shape, because all of these boxes are really bad at keeping their body temperature. So they need more boxes that they call AC, or whatever they call them, these other boxes that heat or cool the big box. And the whole thing is an incredible waste of energy. Like, it's almost, yeah, it's catastrophic in its scale, because it's not just one house here, but it's pretty much almost all the houses, at least in the so-called civilized world. I mean, there is still a lot of people in the world who have not forgotten that a round house may be wise, you know. So it's not a universal problem, but it's one that is very specific to the kind of civilization that we have come out of. And I think, given everything I just said, you know, this is just a story. This is just something we could be telling everyone, really, small and big. But the implications of it are anything but small. You know, this stuff really can play a role that we could not even begin to grasp yet when it comes to addressing all those catastrophes and crises that the world is currently trying to still ignore, but at least more and more people wake up to it and say, we need to change something. We need structural, and we need systemic change because we got structural problems. Yes, because no one knows what a structure is or what a system is. But that's something we can share, right? And that's why I'm sharing these stories with you, because in one of the meetups, there was this question, how can we teach this stuff? You know, how can we bring this to the awareness of people? And I don't know all the ways of doing that, because there's more than I could count, but these are a few that I found that, at least to my mind, open up a willing, open mind, open heart to all kinds of options, all kinds of potential, you know. So that's that.
Thank you, Struppi. Next up is going to be Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Struppi. This has been great, and your reference earlier to quantum leap all of a sudden created a question for me around the orientation we have to geometry, and for the most part, the connection to platonic solids.
Yeah.
And then we go from there to try and understand the four eyes, or the edging, or what I've sometimes called the wire framework, which kind of equates to membrane, I believe. So my question around that's tied to the quantum leap is that it seems to me that it's both important to understand the platonic solid sort of history and everybody's image of platonic solids that are solid, appear to be solid. But it's also a drag on us. In other words, it pulls us into something that we're trying to get out of. So I'm wondering whether or not, in a quantum leap sense, to be able to jump, if you want, from Platonic solids to what I'm now going to call Fulleric, Fulleric relationships, or Fulleric eyes, or Fulleric something. And that we do that leap needs to be done fairly quickly in order to protect us from falling back into the default thinking about geometry as solids. It also is a quantum leap in my mind from the machine model or material model of science into the quantum sciences and other sciences of the 20th century. So can you sort of speak to that? Is that a wild idea? Is it something that we need in terms of teaching? We could find ourselves doing, trying to get people to go from Platonic to Fulleric.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm like, that is what I'm doing in my play, you know, because there is very few things that annoy me as much as the so-called Platonic solids, because not only are they like this fairy tale akin to Santa Claus and that kind of, you know, fabulous reality, and still they are so dogmatic in a way, so very well centered in the base code of this civilization, that most all mathematicians that I've seen speaking about them go teary eyes and, you know, and here's my favorite, whatever, which one that is, the one that everyone knows, which is every time brought back up, that everyone knows this one, that's the cube, the hexahedron, right? So we have the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the hexahedron, the icosahedron, and lastly the pentagonal dodecahedron. That's a lot of hedra, right? And the hedron part, for me, is where this entire language game, this entire story of geometry is putting up a veil to keep us all locked out of the insides of these bodies and the outsides, and only focused on the surface. They declare there to be a surface of, you know, nothingness, of course, because the surface itself is 2D, which is another abstraction that we still don't have. You know, there's nothing real about that either. But they take away the quality of the quantum, which is the aliveness, right? Because the tetrahedron is not alive, as it is stuck together with these other shapes that, you know, can't be shaped. I'm not like I'm doing this abstractly again. No, I'm not. Here, this is the so-called hexahedron without its integral 4 eyes to make it a shape. Again, after our recent conversations, I actually listened to the Timaeus by Plato, where the so-called Platonic solids are spoken about, and the actual cube, the actual hexahedron that Plato spoke of is this one, right? With these in place. So this one, that's, you know, I don't have one at hand, but this one is the box that goes around the 2 dozen around 8 eyes. Maybe I should just grasp one. There's one. Where is the next one? Let me take this. Or is there another one down here? If you only knew. I mean, some of you present actually have an idea what it looks like in here. So you can, there, you can feel me here. Okay, so here, this is the 2 dozen around 8 eyes, also known as Merkaba. Right, so you can see the 8 eyes in the middle, and then there's 8 4 eyes around that. And if we were to draw a connection which isn't there, mind you, between these two, and then all the way around, then we would get this. But this is not even speaking a single peep about the fact that inside of it is this whole entire structure, right? It's just phased out. Never mind that, because that's on the inside and we don't look in that. So, you know, in that very real sense, the Platonic solids are actually keeping us from looking into what these structures are, who they are, right? Here's another example, because I brought it closer, because before we opened the call, Shrikant was showing me his dodecahedra that he's playing with. So I wanted to show him a dodecahedron. I'm sorry about the contrast between the dark straws and me, not much contrast. But you can see how this isn't actually a shape, right? Why is that? Well, because there's no triangulation happening. There's a lot of so-called pentagons, which are another kind of polygon, as they call them in mathematics, which is supposed to be a shape. But it only can be if there's somebody holding that shape, a surface. That's what Baki was always pointing out. The Greek geometers forgot about the very skin, the very body they were drawing their geometry on. They were not addressing that. They were ignoring it. And then it's easy to say, well, a triangle, for a quadrangle, pentagon, it's all the same. It's just n-gons. It's not the same though, right? Because to have shape, we need triangle. And if we keep them out of mind, out of sight, then we're never getting back to reality. And as a side note, I actually did find a place of this dodecahedron within the realms of these structures here. And while I cannot really quite show you the full-scale model I created, because it's really a little messy as a shelf on the wall right now, full of things, I might have, no, where did I drop you? Still there, just a second. I'll get this one. Oh, I hope the microphone isn't too bad on you. Apologies. Here, this is a dozen spheres around none. There's no sphere in the middle. So they come together, and you can see they have the dozen 8 eyes drawn around them and another set of a dozen 8 eyes drawn within them. And this, I can make a fractal of this, where in place of every single sphere here, I put a dozen and 8 eyes on its own, right? So I gather a dozen 8 eyes around none, and the fingers they share, the intersections between them all, that's the so-called Platonic dodecahedron shape. And when all of those are there, then yes, this can hold the shape, because that's all triangulated, right? So that's, if you go back into my videos, you'll find like my first video I did on anything with these structures and things was my attempt to deconstruct the Platonic solids, for the very reason that I don't think it's a valid category to begin with. Not in a far stretch. Plus, and this is where it gets really juicy, the Platonic solids are supposed to be 5, right? We already named them all. And the reason why they are who they are is that they are thought of in terms of, we draw triangles and then squares and then pentagons on a plane, and then we fold them up into the shape. And apparently one cannot do that with a hexagon, so they say. So there is only those 5, because with a hexagon you can't, because it's filling out the plane. But this is curious, because I'll pick one up, but this is far outside of the reach of my headphones. I'll just grab my okay, here. So this is another model of a vector equilibrium, or I call it the Dow dozen 8-eyes, the 2 dozen 8-eyes. Do I have another one that is more clear? This one, perhaps. I showed this in the beginning. That's the same thing. It's just here we don't have the paper in the eyes, right? But that's the same structure. This is a dozen around 1 spheres. And this is what we can do with the hex, because it's not plane, it's not flat, it's not 2D, right? And this is actually, if I take out these bobby pins, which are the preferred means of creating this thing, and it took me a while to get them, but Bucky wrote get bobby pins, and I never did, and then I got them, and it's perfect. It's the perfect thing. So if I take these out, it's a dozen of them for every outside sphere of our vector equilibrium. There's one. Every radius gets one. And then what we're left with is 1, 2, 3, 4 hexagons. Who said we couldn't fold up hexagons into a structure? Because they really do like to fold, like so. And this is what Bucky called the bow tie. And when I do bring 4 of these together, well, it's the inverse of what I just did. When I bring them back together, they make up the vector equilibrium. Now, here we get to a problem, that this is a move that we can't do in conventional geometry. Why? Well, because in conventional geometry, the one of the Greek, this shape, or not really this shape, but its equivalent, is called the cube octahedron. But that's another hedron. It's a superficial thing where we have a surface made up of 6 squares, whatever they are, and 8 triangles. So it's an Archimedean solid, not a Platonic one, because Platonic solids are all the same shape. And since we have here a square in the mix with a triangle, it's not Platonic per definition. However, there is no square. You see, if I hold this just as it is, without balancing it artificially in the place of equilibrium, I guess, then unless it's here, then this square is not a square. It's either this or that, but not a square. And there is no surface there either. So the cube octahedron as such does not have a nucleus. It does not have a heart. It's not anything but that surface, right? So it cannot move. It cannot jump. It cannot dance, right? So this is where synergetics, in a way, is a paradigmatic quantum leap of a scale, a scope that we have no comparison to. Because everything we've done until now was done, consciously or not, under the supremacy of the Greek geometry as the frame of mind that people have been using. You know, one begins anything by taking a square piece of paper or rectangular. I am using square and cube a little, openly. I do consider rectangles to be squares in the end as well. So bear with me on that. But we begin our contemplation by taking up a book, which is a box. We take up a paper, which is a square. We draw out our grid of squares, and if we do make a mistake, we go back to square one. And that's completely normal, right? That's the way it's supposed to be, because everything has been pre-manufactured to fit that frame of mind. But the consequence of that is that people are never open to receive and perceive the reality they find themselves in. Do I really need to make first plain the entire lot before I can plant a new garden? You know, do I really need to erase everything that was present so that my mental plan can be turned out into the perfect or sort of perfect exposition of that plan? No, no, we don't have to go into that uniform preset where we get no choice at all, but the exact same choice all over again, because we can just circumvent the entire thing, the entire abstraction, and let it be there. We don't need to abandon it, you know. If need be, we can look back into it. And I guess until a few generations from now, we will probably have more or less still a very good sense of how the Platonic geometry works, right? I grew up with it. I am well versed in making boxes. I can if I need to, but I find myself not needing them. I don't have to. And if I don't have to, I don't want to do them anymore. You know, I can do all kinds of beautiful things instead. And they are fun. They are comfortable. They are resilient. They come with integrity. They are complementing everyone else. They are not taking up much space, but they're giving a lot more than what they take. Right? And that's a whole lot of generalizable things that are going on with these structures that are just there for us to mind and to engage with. Right? But I think it's very difficult to get to that place, to get to that sense of familiarity and that kinship, as long as we stick with the language that strips life away from these things.
Thank you. Thank you, Struppi. All right, Struppi, shall we continue on to spherical time? And I want to leave time at the end so people can talk about everything that they're getting from Bucky and all these presentations. Go ahead, Struppi.
Yeah, I think there was a question in the chat by Susan. Is it accurate
to answer it? Yeah, go ahead.
Is it accurate to believe that biochemists embrace and appreciate hydra shapes as they explore complex molecules? Well, I hope they do. I mean, well, I don't necessarily hope that they embrace hydra shapes, again, because I don't think that, you know, it's kind of like a rounding error thing where we're stuck in the abstraction because of the words we use, because of the language and the mental models that they come with. So we're never ever actually getting to the level where nature, as we call her, universe, is playing at. But at the same time, people like biochemists, because of their field, because of their interest, they're interested to see what so-called nature is up to. And so they have no way around engaging with these shapes because they are everywhere, right? All we are is these things on a level of complexity that, I mean, it takes a couple of billion years to play out that level of complexity, right? But it's, yeah, like one of the more popular examples of this is the Buckminster fullerene, as they call it, C60, which is a carbon molecule that was called Buckminster fullerene after Buckminster Fuller posthumously because they kind of, oh, look, it's a geodesic dome. What? You know, kind of that situation. But at the same time, the virology, for instance, is full of these shapes as well, because like the go-to shape that universe chooses when it has to wrap up a piece of helix data information wrapping inside of a membrane that is capable of keeping that safe and moving it somewhere and then delivering it. What nature or universe really chooses is usually a good choice, which is the dozen and eight eyes. Like the capsids of most viruses, including COVID-19, that's a 2-frequency dozen eight eyes. Like I got one here. That's the shell of the equivalent to the shell of the COVID-19 virus. And if you were to count the spheres in this one, this is a 2-frequency, it's 3.5 dozen, or in other words, 42. And if you look at the animations they did of the virus, you find that they have 42 little 4 eyes sticking out of it, which goes to show that the frequency of the shell is the 2-frequency one. And, you know, there's evidence anywhere we want to look, right? It's everywhere, really. It's just that we're not usually attuned to see the connections, because the framework that we apply kind of goes around them, takes the awkward turn around them. By the way, these models, this and a couple more, have come out of your conversation with Tom Miller. I had to make these, and it's been great to make them. And anyways, that's a whole different.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I just want to say one
Yes,
thing
please.
before we go on. So I want to encourage people to actually make these things. You know, first time you did the meetups, I've met with my friend Rupali, who's here, and we made all of these things. And then, you know, onto these and onto this. And then when I met with Tom Miller, he has this idea of skeleton. So I took all these things and built skeleton in it. So I had already built one of these. I'd built one of these, the 20 eyes, and then with, you know, after I met with Tom, I went ahead and put all the centers in it, so you can see all the 20 4 eyes inside of it. So I strongly encourage. It's actually quite easy. I'm not very good at doing this, but it's quite easy to make it. And you actually understand what these shapes are if you make them. I think it's, you know, actually engaging with these shapes with your hands is the best way of actually understanding them. Otherwise, you can't.
Yes.
Go ahead, Struppi.
I completely agree, because, you know, the Platonic mindset also keeps our minds locked in the head, right? People think they are thinking, and that's why they are, right? But the thinking sense is one sense of our body among a number of senses, and they really all integrate into one being. And the verbal, you know, the language, all these living systems that nest within us and between us are really, they are there to play. They are there to speak to these things. But people, by means of having been brought up in this framework, consider their mind to be something exclusively found within their heads, in their brain, perhaps. You know, how often they speak of picking someone's brains, quite literally, or having animations of the brain of Turing, for instance. Here is a brilliant mind. And I'm like, holy cow, how is that gonna be anything but a bag of, you know, I don't know what it's perhaps it's good for compost after all, but it's not alive anymore. You know, it's not, the mind has left the building, right? And for the mind to be whole, it needs the integrity of the inside and the outside, and it expands through both, right? So the way to grasp and fathom reality is by engaging through the hands, because we can actually expand our mind through creating these things. Every one of them is nothing but an expansion of my mind.
I want to just add, I can't resist adding one thing. Take the word, even the words are like that. Take the word grasp. Grasp goes from grasping in the physical world to grasping mentally. Until you can do both, you can't do either, actually. So wonderful.
Yes.
Let's go
Yes.
on to time.
Yes. For reasons of time, let's go on to time. All right. So what I wanted to speak to in regards to time is greatly, yeah, what's the word for that? I am grateful for the capacity of bringing this kind of explanation to you, which I have learned from David Abram, the author of Becoming Animal and Spell of the Sensuous. And I truly think Spell of the Sensuous would be a more than brilliant addition to the 52 Living Ideas mindscape.
Please introduce us, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot recommend this book enough. I think it's among like synergetics and that one, Spell of the Sensuous, might be and Tao Te Ching, they might be the three most influential books in my life that had the greatest shifts happening through them. And in Spell of the Sensuous, what David Abrams, the author, is doing is he looks deeply into the nature of oral traditions and literal traditions, and he compares them. He looks into what people call shamanism. He looks into animism, and he looks into and listens to the wisdom of those traditions around the world, those languages that have not yet been caught up within the trappings of the alphabetic or literal mind, where we don't need to be trapped at all. I'm not saying that, like David Abram is an author, he loves books, it's not like we hate language or writing. It's just the way it's framed keeps us trapped, when really it could just be yet another way of opening and freeing our minds. So
let me add one thing, Struppi.
Yes.
The best quote I know of this is a gentleman called Walter Ong, who has studied the oral and literacy. So his entire life's work is on that. So his quote is, all text is pretext. And I would add to that, all text is pretext because it forgets the context. So it is, in the oral tradition, you never lose the context. The context is all around you and you are interacting with it. In the text, when you print it out, it is separated out from the person creating it, and it is separate from the person receiving it, and it is seen as something by itself. And it actually lives in the interaction between the world and the concepts, in both the speaker and the listener. And that deep connection, which makes the text live, is lost very often when you use printing as the only means and forget the entire oral tradition, which used to envelope all of the writing. Please go ahead.
Yes. And this speaks very much to the core of the book, because the main interest of that book is to look into the origins of the alphabet and how that changed the mind as a technology. Because until then, all scripts were, either ideographic, drawings like the Chinese characters, or the hieroglyphics, or even the origins of the alphabet, the alphabet. But the alphabet, as the old Hebrew script, was one which is only, what's them called? Consonants. Yes, only consonants, no vowels. That's a wild thing for our mind to wrap around. But it changes a lot. And even within our tradition of the alphabet, the possibility, the ability to read quietly is only a couple hundred years old. Before that, every time people read, they read loud. There was no other way. And just yesterday, I heard someone saying how curious that oral and oral are so close, right? Oral and oral. Yes. So what happened when the alphabet was taken by the Phoenicians and the Greek and turned into the alphabet was a shift from a script that was only consonants, so only the shape of the body, not the sound of the breath, not the vowels, which means, you know, reading the Torah in its original script, people could not have a literal sense of the text because there's no single meaning. If all the vocals are, the vowels are free to dialogue, right? So if I'm reading the text today and I put in those vowels, it might mean a different thing than if I put on another set of vowels. So it's a distinct dialogue, a reciprocity between reader and read. And that was gone by the time that the Greek turned it into the alphabet. You know, the aleph, the first letter in the alphabet looked like this. And it was, the word aleph meant bull. So it's a bull's head, and it means bull. And the Greek took it and turned it this way around and called it alpha, and made it the first of the first of the vowels, right? And it was not a bull anymore. That link was broken. But not only that link, but also the entire sense of reciprocity with the words, because for the first time we have gotten a script that is able to codify the spoken word in its entirety, consonants and vowels at once. So it's enabling a few generations later with Plato and his companions, it's enabling them to get to this level of abstraction where they consider, you know, the spirit, the ratio as separate from the body, and they think that the words, you know, this whole, and looking into abstractions in that time where we have someone within an oral tradition going out asking people, so what is love? And they go, well, you know, that one time, or that one, or giving examples of love. But that's not what the question was looking for, because it wanted a definition of the word love in an abstraction. That was a completely novel concept at the time. And it's only now that we take it for granted, and this is the way it is, you know, and everything else seems foreign. But that shift falls together with the geometry thing. It falls together with a lot of things, patriarchy coming into play, and so many things at that time. I mean, not narrowly in that time, but generally speaking in that time, a lot of things were set in stone. Yeah, but a lot of things got lost too. And the primary thing that got lost again is the sense of the bodies. Because to write down the script, we need a body to write on. Same as with the drawing of the geometry. We cannot write anything unless we have someone to write on. And if that is a book, okay, it's a book. But then we write out the lines, and the book remembers them, carries them in its flesh, right? Still an animate living being. And it's our choice to ignore the animate body and say, oh, it's the body of the book, never mind that, it's the text that matters. And we don't need the book for the text, not anymore at least. Now we have the digital bodies that carry them. But
sorry,
yes.
I just want to
Yes.
add one more thing. This is from, you know, along the same lines, One of my absolute favorite on language is Julian Jaynes. And I decided to read out the chapter and make it available on YouTube, because I found that, I wanted to go, this was primarily for myself, because I wanted to go through it very carefully. And I thought just speaking it out. So I've been listening to it a little bit myself, but this actually captures the same point. He says, because in our brief lives, we catch so little of the vastness of history, we tend too much to think of language as being solid as a dictionary with granite-like permanence, rather than as a rampant, restless sea of metaphors, which it is.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. And I mean, this, all that we're speaking to now is really the same story. Whether we look at it from the geometric point of view, which in a way is even more fundamental to our sense of reality, or if we're looking only into the world of the written word. But there is magic there, incredibly powerful magic, not in an abstract sense of magic, but real sense of magic. You know how absolutely incredible it must have been to the oral cultures in the world when first the Europeans came up with their first book, the Bible, opening up that thing and then reading something that was, how can it be that the word is caught in something that isn't speaking, right? It's the translation into the form where the hands draw out the story into a storyline that enables this. But it's also the synesthesia happening whenever we look at the word and we hear its sound in our head. That is synesthesia. But our senses are synesthetic at all together. That's another one of the takeaways from that book, because we do have two eyes but one sight, two ears but one hearing, and so forth. All our senses are already integrating a plurality of sources into our experience. So this is another case of a powerful kind of technology that enables a magic to happen that is fine and beautiful in its own right, but it has been abused in a way by taking away the mind from the body and negating the body. And this is, this happens on many, 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 many layers, including in case of patriarchy, the way that the body and the female and all of these things are read as something negative, while the male and the spirit are supreme, and all this hierarchy. That's a complete confusion. If we look at it from the perspective of the whole of the Tao, then we see nothing can be without the other. They are mutually arising, they're complementing, compending. So it's no good to say one is better than the other. That is not going to help at all. In fact, it's actually caused a lot of violence and destruction and disruption and trauma in the world that is unspeakable, but still present. And
wonderful.
now,
Let's go on to time.
Yes, I'm taking the long term to that because I think this is all relevant to it.
No,
First,
all of it. See, Struppi, this is what is amazing about these conversations.
Yeah.
We explore all of these are connected. They are intimately connected.
Yes.
Together, and it's wonderful that we can just talk like this. So
yeah, and we're doing this processionally in a way.
Yes.
I've got my focus is on the time that I want to get to, but to get there, I'm going to go around, so we get a better sense of what it is that we're looking at. So, all of this was to say the same way that Bucky has been pointing out that the Greek geometers only naming 3 tools for geometry left out the fourth, the body that they wrote on. The same way, in a similar way, it happens with the book, with the written word, with the alphabet, because people write down the word and then they say, oh, it's only symbolic. It's only signs that signify nothing. It's, and it comes with this sense of time as a linear thing, because the word written into the books is thought of as a line, going line by line by line by line, and we can trace back the line. We can go back, and tracing is actually a good sign, because in the natural world, in universe, there's a lots of traces, right? If I'm following an animal, I can follow its traces, because the traces have written out their story on the ground for me to read if I'm able to, and then I can really see the animal moving through the landscape, even though it's been hours before, right? So there's a way in which this seems to be linear, but it's a stretch of imagination to say that time is linear or stories are linear because we write them down that way. In fact, all of our time measuring devices for the longest part have been spherical, at least cyclical devices, going round and round and round. And only the historic accounting has given rise to the idea of a timeline, because now we can point to the oldest book and say, look, that's the beginning, the origin. And from then on, we have a record of what we call his story. Lots of stories of them being his. And, Alan Watts speaks to the fact that this whole thing with Jesus being only one Jesus could be, how that led to the historical mindset that history is a one-way street, that it is a linear process going from the past to the future, never to return. Now, I'm not saying that we're going in circles in the sense of, tomorrow is just going to be another yesterday. Yeah, in a way, but really, all of those things, let's go into them in a second. Because after all that pointing out that the bodies are there for us to write upon, to remember through, to kind of expand our mind into the body of the book so that it can grow there and we can reflect on it and have a dialogue with ourselves, that's a beautiful thing. For as long as we keep in mind that we have enchanted this book, we have spellbound the words, spelled out the stories, and there is magic there. Now, to go back in the circle a long way to David Abram looking not only into the alphabet thing, but also into the oral traditions. He found as a more or less universal condition in the oral traditions he looked into that they did not actually have a distinction between time and space. They had place. They have place. They take place and they have place. And place is always space and time in one. Now, how come we don't think of them as one to begin with? Well, that's the whole thing with the books, because we write out the geometry and think it's static, it's solid, it's abstract, it's only symbolic, it's only mental. We similarly write down the story and say, okay, here's the beginning, there's the end. Here is the top left of the sheet paper of music, and there's the bottom right, and we go once and never return. So there is a way in which the specific technology in which we codify the word and the geometry makes us believe that these things are linear or abstract. I mean, even linear itself, yes, there's a linear relationship, but it's not less than the spherical one, because it's one kind of spherical relationship. You know, it's a member of the whole thing and not something distinct from, separate from. Okay, so with that in mind, David sat down, and this is where I kind of go into the story he told in the book. He sat down on a hill and thought about this. Well, time. We think of time in three realms. We think of the past, the future, and the present. And we can qualify them. The past is this closed space, this closed time. We can't go back into it. We can only remember it. We can recall it, but we can't return into it. The future, on the other hand, is an open space. We don't know what's coming, only that something is coming, but not what. Whereas the present is this fleeting moment in between. Now, if we do frame those things in terms of linear thinking, as they call it, and we think of the timeline, which also is a deadline, where present is that 0, which is still, it's actually not moving, but it's supposed to be moving. Actually, I guess the line is moving. Anyways, nothing is moving. It's just still. And one way is past and one way is future. And everything everybody thinks that we can agree on that. But here is what David draws our attention to. He thinks, he feels into it and says, well, the past, this closed body, where is it? Where is it right now, where I am? And he realized there's not just one, there's a plurality of pasts, and they're always within the bodies, right? So I, myself, as a body, I carry different layers of pasts. I carry my genetic past, I carry scars. The very body I have is the way that it grew through being what it is, you know, and still tells the story of growing in that shape. I have also my memories within me, you know, my stories, my songs, my sounds, my memories. Those are within me. Then I look outside of me and I see a tree, and the tree itself is a sphere growing this way and that way and everywhere around, and people cut them in the middle and they look at them and so see the rings, which are, you know, the middle of a sphere cut through. That's the rings. And every year there's a new ring. So in the flesh of the tree, in the wood, it remembers its whole life, right? Every year has written its record into the flesh of the tree. In the same way, we have geological time, where the earth itself is a memory bank, remembering layers and layers of pasts gone by. Within them, within the ground, archaeology, geology, these things, right? So multiple examples, we could name more if need be, but this is to say, let's just, for the sake of argument, consider this closed off bit of time that we call, or realm of time that we call past. Let's consider that as the insides of the bodies, right? And then it becomes clear, a book itself, you know, is a body, and it's passed, like the storyline passed through the book, and the trace remains, so we can read back into it. But we cannot actually get back into the past. We can dig out the archaeology, but we will not come back into the moment when it was alive, in that context it was in. All right, so that's one side. In the other, in the future, that's open. And if we're looking around us right now, everyone, we see the world as it is open to our eyes by the presence of air. That's a big body. That's very important to keep in mind, because it's the one that traverses inside and outside. I'm getting to that. But it also opens up our view to see everything that is present. around us, in our presence, where we can't look into the bodies, we can't look into their pasts, we can ask them for their past, but what they show us is only the present, one side they present to us. But there's another side, the reverse. And I'm tricking myself here. I can see the reverse of my hand on the screen. But really, when I'm looking at my hand, from my own point of view, I see one side. And it doesn't matter if it's this one or the other one. I see one side, and the other is just the other. You know, it's the same thing, just back and forth. But one side only. And there's a horizon around the whole thing where I can't look past. I must look around. So either I must move, or what I'm looking at has to move. Space-time has to spin, you know, and there's a closed horizon, a closed future, like my hand. Like if I had the bug walking on my arm, I would not know it's there until I see it, and then it's in my presence. But until then, it was in my future, beyond what I could see. But there's the distant future as well. If I look at the horizon around me in the landscape, you know, I can make guesses at what might lie there. I see there's a tree line going there, a street, a river, whatever it is, and I can make up my mind from experience what may be there. But unless I go there, I have no idea. It's just an open realm of possibilities. And the very act of going there gets me into a place where I am present in that place. So it's not future anymore. The future's moved with me, in other words. All right, so those are the three. We have the pasts within, we have the futures beyond, and we have the presence between the bodies. And that's a very large realm between, because it's multisensorial, it's very multifaceted as well. And it's the medium of that presence is the air, because it's our breath going in and out and in, going both ways, as the fingers pointing both ways. It's that breath that has us present amongst our kin on kinship earth, because we're all embedded in this big body of air, this air ocean, and we're all participating in it actively as we breathe and as we move. And it's a curious thing about the English tongue that the word for mind and the word for wind are almost the same, just sort of mirrored as the wind moves in and out. Right? So that's the three we're familiar with, and I would say there's a fourth one too. And I would like to call it dream time, because that's already a term attributed by some cultures to this. And I think it speaks to this innate capacity we have to transverse the realms, right? Because I can, because of my experience, what I carry within me, I can look at what is without me and see how it became what it is, or what it may become in time. So I'm not only living in the presence, but the integration of all of these aspects of space-time really allow me to direct the presence, to shape the future, to get things flowing in whatever way we need. But I feel it's very, very necessary that we integrate our sense of time back in the embodied, back in this presence, in the animate real, because even the clock time, that's the bodies of the clocks, and they have been designed the way that they are as stable in their rhythm as they could be, because everybody is having their own time, right? Everyone has their own time. And the presence is this partially overlapping, as Bucky called it, you know, the partially overlapping scenario of us meeting. bringing each their own time into the mix and doing so mindfully, but to think that there is this level of time that is ultimate, that is absolute and linear, that again is easy to get to if we're used to clock time being time. If that is the implicit sense of time we have, where we all say, well, the clock is saying it's a minute, however my sense of time may go, that that comes with the possibility of distraction from what is real, from what is going on, from the sense of now, because now is everything at once. Now is the presents, the pasts, and the futures at once. But we need, I think, to get away from this linear sense of time where, for instance, an example is that for as long as Bucky has been doing his stuff, the geodesic dome has been called the House of Tomorrow. There's even a brilliant movie by the name, The House of Tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. 50 years ago it was the House of Tomorrow, and still there is companies today labeling the geodesic dome as the future. It's never going to come that way. We're never going to be waking up and saying, oh, today's tomorrow, everyone's doming now. That's not going to come because it's removed from now. And the same is true for all these climate politics, all these big plans where they set up a deadline again sometime in the future, and they say, this is the date, until then we have time to change, and if we don't, we're doomed. But anyways, it's in the future, and if we don't get there in time, we just move it a little further, right? But that is a trick of mind that is actually inhibiting our potential of being now, being present, knowing the now, knowing the know, and changing the flow, the way that things go round and round and grow whole, because there is a place to be for everyone, where we can meet one another and listen to one another, ask one another, what is it that I can do for you? And what can I do for you now? Is a more important question than what can I do for you in 10 years? Because we never know if we make it there. So let's, bring that sense, have the line that has been cut and wrap it back up and make a new knot in there. And perhaps it's one of these knots. Like I just made this, I'm showing it to Varia specifically because I was making it while she was still here. There you go. That's a knot, a trefoil knot out of 4 eyes. It's an endless knot, not to be untied. Yes, anyways, that's what I have to say and share on the matter of time as an aspect of space-time.
Wonderful. I have one clarificatory question, and
Yes.
then I would open it up to everybody. I understand past as being in body.
Yes.
I understand present as being between bodies. Can you please explain again how you see future as
Yes.
being beyond bodies? Can you just focus on the future, please?
Yes. I mean, there's a way in which beyond is perhaps one way to say, another is behind. Future is what is sort of present, but it's the side of the presence that we don't see because the bodies are in the way, right? And to get a sense of what is there, movement needs to happen. And in a way, if we look at one of the cycles of time that we experience day by day, the day and night cycles, what we do have here is the moment where we are sitting on the earth, on the ground here, for instance, and maybe that light is light enough to cast a light. And if I'm sitting here on the far side of Earth, then the body of Earth is casting its shadow upon me. And the shadow is basically the memory inside of the sphere of light that comes from the sun, of the presence of the Earth in that sphere. And as the sphere of light grows out from the sun and the Earth moves around, it's actually drawing a spiral of shadow within that sphere. And if someone was in the perfect place 1,000,000 years from now, over there, sitting, looking just in that moment when the shadow line would pass them by, they might not see the sun in that second and be reminded of the presence of Earth, long ago, far away, but still present. Right? So if I'm sitting on the Earth and I'm turning with her, and I come to the place where we come into the presence of the sun, that's when we get into day, right? And as long as we're in the day, we're casting our own shadow and casting our own spheres of light as well, right? Because we can only be seen because we're casting our light sphere everywhere around us. And unless there's someone in the middle looking at us, seeing us in their way, casting a shadow, the sphere of light is just going to grow as well, right? But that sense of where is the sun when I go back into the night side? Well, it's in the future. It's hidden behind the sun, behind the Earth in that moment. So until the morning comes and I come back into its presence, it's in my future, my future. That's, time is a very relative thing, very much depending on, or depending on the point of view that we're looking at the given system. And that is true. Like, even in conventional science with relativity and everything, we now know that there is no uniform time, because the more gravity we have, the slower time goes, or is it faster? I'm always confused. But that memory moment in the night side, where the Earth, basically the sun is below the ground from one perspective, right? It's in the memory of the Earth in that way. It's sort of, from our point of view, it's almost as if it is inside the Earth. And then we get back out on the other side and the light comes in, and that, we you know, it's a bit of a different way to frame the experience that we're having, where the authority is taken a little away from the storylines of the lines and the clock time and the universality of these things, the supremacy really of that frame of mind. And we take a step back and say, okay, but all of that is grown from the bodies and they have their own truth. And if we listen to that, and if we grow aware of that, we have a very different place to be ourselves and to meet one another openly with a regard and an appreciation for the multiplicity of perspectives on the world that comes in particular at us through the minds and hearts and beings of indigenous folks around the world. Because again, they are, perhaps if they've been lucky to maintain their ways against all odds with colonialism at the bay, perhaps they have carried on within their language this understanding, whatever language it is, whatever understanding they have, it's qualitatively very different from the one we've been brought up to believe as a universal. And perhaps taking another look at that allows us to take another look at one another. And for me, at least, reading this explanation of time in that book was a moment where, for the first time, I had a sense, as you were speaking before we had the talk here, the change, the felt change through the word, right? I felt changed because I, for once, found myself in the now, being able to say, to understand what these time frames, these timescapes really are.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. And this is exactly the same pattern as the geometry.
Yeah.
Because what the Greeks did was that they built up this quote unquote space, and then they said
Yes.
universe is in that space. And then let's look at the universe as a post facto thing, with the space being mapped out with these non-existent lines and points and everything. Similarly, you're saying, it is the same issue of saying you map out the time and now let's put everything in. Whereas when you switch it over with the spheres, you're saying these are the spheres, and let's see what kind of space that is built out of this. So under the similarly, the time, you're saying each person is measuring the time from their vantage point, and in them and around them and beyond them. And there are many, many, many such measurements that are taking place. That is reality. So another kind of a way of saying it is time is in universe, not universe is not in time. So it's like, it's not like there is a time that is there and there is universe in it. No, it's universe, which is the primary, and time is in it. So you have to figure out a way of measuring it with respect to things within it. Wonderful.
It's a means of, like, a measurement is a secondary step, because first of all, time is a set of relationships between the insides and outsides of everyone. And as I say again and again, a sphere, a body, the whole identity of a body is universe. It's inside and outside. But we also find insides within the insides, and outsides within the outsides, and insides within the outsides, and outsides within the insides, and so forth. Right? So that's why there is this incredible complexity to it. But with this kind of dynamic stance that we get here, right, where we can let go of a lot of the weight that has, compressed us, as they say, to the ground. We can let go of that and kind of dance among the stars and see that time is really life. Time is what we call the different paces that people and beings and kin and stars and everyone live through, everyone with their own beginnings and ends and re-beginnings and transformations, because one end is the beginning of another. And with that, I think we gain a place of integrity where we can look at everything as it is and make sense in relationship between what is, what we understand of it, what is there beyond, and so forth. And it's not taking away from anything. It's not taking even away from the linear sense of time. It's just complementing it and saying, okay, I get why people think that way, because they've been brought up in this kind of context, which chooses to ignore all of that. And given that as a context, it's reasonable to think it is that way. But in the larger context, there is a lot of paradoxes that come out of it, like the layers of paradoxes that come out of the abstractions is absurd. But it's okay. I think we're in a lot of sense, or in a deep sense, where it's almost as if a child's play has taken hold of humanity. Humanimals have been forced to agree with and conform with a frame of mind that is foreign to our being, that is alien to universe in a deep sense. And we've been caught up in that, doing the best we can within that, which is still going to cause harm. Right?
Wonderful.
So I'm not trying to give my best. I'm just trying to be true to what I feel drawn out of me by the presence that I find myself in.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Struppi. All right, folks, it's time for comments and questions on this idea of spherical time. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Right? Who would like to go first? I see Richard typing away. So Richard.
I'm not so sure I was typing away, but
Okay.
I was not so much on the spherical time, although I think it's really quite appropriate for us to think in this kind of concept, because it's the idea of, for me, regeneration in a spherical sense, so that the end of one's life, if you want, is a regenerative part of living, and it's that life that one has lived is then carried on through others, and so there's a constant regenerating of life in that sense. But my question or comment is that I've been having trouble as I work between the planar sense of a system and the spatial sense. And normally we talk about two-dimensional, meaning the planar sense, and three-dimensional. But then when I presented on the social tensegrity side of things, I got myself into trouble, and I've known that in the past, that when you talk about the importance of the observer and the observed, and Bucky's contention that when you put them together, if you want, even in the 60-degree angle of a tetrahedron, you have a minimum of 4 dimensions, the observer and the 3-dimensional world around you, the XYZ world. So in feedback to me, I was actually Kirby Owner that said, get rid of the notion of dimensions, 2, 3, 4, doesn't matter, and just talk in the language of flat or planar, and in spherical or spatial. And that's what I'm going to try and do now as I work with the notion of different dimensions, but trying to speak to the shapes. And I now go back and forth as to whether I should work with the tetrahedron in its flat shape and stretched out to solve the interconnections, or I should try and do it in its spatial shape, either in a model, a physical model, or to try and get the eye to see a diagram in its 3-dimensional form, which is hard to do on a plain sheet for some of us. And Kirby introduced me to what was called the Becker cube, that helps the eye figure out whether or not it sees the depths or it sees sort of a top-down to capture the notion of 3-dimensional. So what do you think of that? I mean, that's what I've been learning out of all of our discussions. So now it's simple, but I think it's going to be profound for me to move from dimensional talk to flat and spatial talk. Or spherical talk.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm practicing too, right? I'm speaking of flat when I speak to what people call 2D, I speak of flat, because they draw something out on a piece of paper and then they call it 2D, but really it's a flat piece of paper. It's still a whole body. It's got depth to it. It's just somewhat reduced in one direction. But a flat piece of paper can still be folded into something, right? 2D thing cannot be folded because it's not real. But we don't need to go into the unreal, into the abstraction of calling linear 1D, calling planar or flatness 2D, calling volume 3D. because we do have the other words, right? We like linear may seem to be the same as one-dimensional. I would think linear is something that is before we call something 1D, because the 1D is the whole abstract thing, whereas the linear is speaking only to the relationship between two bodies, but it's not taking away the bodies. It's not reducing the body to nothingness, right? And in the same way, to me, like 2D is flat, and the planar thing is already a different thing, because to have something planar, we do need to have planes in them, and to have planes is to have triangles. There is no plane unless there's a triangle. I mean, I'm speaking from experience here, and I would love if anyone had an example that shows otherwise, but I don't think there is. You know, Bucky was saying in synergetics that universe is a priori four-dimensional. And when he said four-dimensional, he did not mean 3D plus time. He meant really he spoke to the four planes that we find both in the four eyes, as its four eyes, as well as in the four hexagon planes that we find in the vector equilibrium. That's the four planes of space-time. And it's not just that, because we can fold it into all kinds of funky golden ratio organic structures as well, where we don't need to follow the crystalline kind of perfection. You know, we don't need to achieve perfection if we can do the living thing. And when it comes to the bodies, I personally think I speak more of voluminous rather than, or volumetric rather than spatial, because spatial, again, is already bound up in the dichotomy between spatial and temporal. You know, it's already speaking to the same kind of presupposed presence of space, which is different than time, right? And it's a balancing act. I mean, I'm constantly teaching and training myself, my expression, my wording, to reflect the things that I really want to say, rather than to use synonyms or words that may speak of a similar thing, but with a different, like a different frame of mind in the context of the word, right? And I found this conversation you had, I mean, both your presentation, that was brilliant on its own, but I also found this conversation you had afterwards. Hexa, ciao, Varia. Yeah. Sorry, I found this whole this dialogue very, very interesting, because it's you know, I think it's something we need to come to terms with, I think, is a good way to phrase this, right? In one of the meetups, someone spoke of zeroing in on something. I love that, because that's speaking of bringing zero, you know, this into the middle of whatever we're looking at. This is now the system we're looking at. How do we make sense of it? Here is zero. That's where we begin this time. But as it is embedded within the sense that everything is already embodied, you know, like the vacuum of space is a term that we throw out randomly, where people think out there, outer space, it's all empty and stuff. But how is it? It's full of light. I mean, we see the light only along the radii towards the center of the light sphere. We don't see the circumference of the light sphere because that's gravity. But it's full of light. Like, find a place in universe where you don't catch the light of at least one kind of star somewhere, right? So when there is light present, that is vibrations, electromagnetic vibrations of a whole spectrum, not just one frequency, but an analog range of frequencies depending on the light source and everything. So all those kinds of frequencies on their own are growing these kinds of wave structures all through one another, all intermingled and intertwined. And we don't see them because, again, we only see along the radius. Ah, there's a star. But the whole thing is present. And it's a body, in this case, a light body, that we cannot, you know, keep hold of in the way that we would what we call a physical body. But it's not less physical, right? Just because it's not graspable, because it just keeps shining on you, you know. Oh, there's the light. You know, try to catch the laser pointer. It always escapes me.
So,
Yes.
Struppi, I want to ask you this question because you have been, you know, we've been doing these meetups at 9 p.m., which is a terrible time in Europe.
It's
but you've been watching all. What's that?
It's a good time to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. But you've been watching many of the videos.
Yes.
You were the first person, you know, yours presentation was the first. And now we are on, April 2nd. So it's almost like how much? So January, February, March. So 3 months. What has been your experience watching all the meetups? What do you think? What would you like to talk about?
Well, a few things I've already kind of brought in because they relate to the things I was bringing up before. Like I really found that moment very interesting and exciting to think about this question that came up in the dialogue between Richard and Doug in terms of the shape of the triangle and its place within the drama and everything. And I think it also speaks to some of the things that came up later in Richard's presentation on social tensegrity, how it can be that the triangle is rendered or considered a structure, or not a structure, but a destructive setting for a social context. And I think that is to do because it's got to do with it not actually being triangle, right? If it were triangle, then there would be exchange between all three members. And it doesn't need to be equal, like it can be a left angle where everything is equal weights and stuff, but a triangle doesn't need to be that to be a triangle, right? In reality, in our relationships, there is going to be different weights, different sizes to the three corners of it. And still, if we mind the triangle actively, and we think, okay, I don't just have a connection to you and you to me and you to the other, but I also can get a connection with the other. And opening up to that, what this does is, again, it brings us into the circumferential perspective. And which with that, we have the precessional sense of looking at our common center. And that's a good place to look at sometimes, you know, to bring up the awareness towards our shared center of gravity. What is our relationship between us three? Not just between you and me and you and you and them and me and them, but between us three. And I think we're not, I mean, speaking from my own experience, I couldn't say that I'm very well experienced in facilitating such exchange, right? It's because the society and the cultural habits that I've inherited, including the fact that my family has always been sitting on a square table, not square, but rectangular. So there is no circle there to come into, right? There is many layers in which we're not really accustomed to triangulation in that sense. And to allow that to actually happen, I think changes the relationship from one that is perhaps very volatile, into one where if we recognize one another as this triangle and we recognize the triangle as its own, the synergy between us, you know, there is a lot more room to grow from rather than to have to stay in conflict. I think that's one of the things that John brought up on the precession talk, which I found brilliant, of saying, you know, say we're in a conversation and my partner says something and they're making a mistake, and I think, oh, should I correct them? Well, if I did, I would stir up conflict. I would go against them in a way, and they would go in defensive mode, and this whole thing, and he said it, would spin out of control. That's really what happens in that case. We don't know where it goes from there. But rather than going that direct way, perhaps I should look into the common center of our conversation and think, is it really necessary to correct the mistake right now? Or is it negligible because that's not really the point of the conversation and I can talk to it another time or whatever, right? That kind of shift is something that is open to us in reality, even though we're conditioned not to see it, not to recognize it in most cases.
Thank you. Struppi, what I want to do is I really want this conversation to continue. I want to give a chance for people to ask you to comment more. I need to catch a train, so I will be moving on to my phone. I will still be there, but Evanik will be doing the moderating. In a few minutes, I will, I'll just move there. I'll be there. And I'll be participating, but I'll be on the phone. So this is the great thing about the technology, that we can be doing this. So let's go with Rupali, followed by Richard. And Struppi, in the middle, you can address these things and you can keep on commenting on any other meetup, because I would love to hear what you have to say.
Whatever comes up. But just before Rupali, I see you already, but I'm going to let my cat back in because I let her out before the call started, and she's been
Rupali, wait for the cat.
ringing at the window.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, it's very important to wait for cats.
Yes.
Well, while we're waiting, what I wanted to share
go ahead.
is that there's something Bucky taught me as well. When you have a triangle and you push out the three sides of the triangle into a curve, you get a circle.
Mm-hmm.
So he said that a circle is nothing but a big triangle.
Yeah.
So I don't think a lot of us think that way. We think circles and triangles are separate.
Different things, yes.
Then when you have a tetrahedron, the three-dimensional, if you want, side, and you push its edges out, you get a sphere.
Yes.
And if you drew it on a two-dimensional, so that you actually had the stick form of the tetrahedron, and you pushed out the circle, you would see the traditional peace sign symbol.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Next up is going to be Rupali, followed by Richard. Rupali, go ahead.
Struppi, thank you again. I want to go back to the very beginning when you talked about what is a sphere. And I absolutely loved, I think Richard just talked about it a bit, about how a triangle is a circle. And I see it when our students take a triangle and they trace it, they just keep rotating it till they get all the points of the circle. And when you said the sphere is nothing but an envelope on the tetrahedron, and it takes a leap of imagination to see all those connecting points becoming a hexagon, and then more vertices to then form the dome or the sphere. So thank you for sharing that. I want you to talk about time being spherical. So in the Indian context, time is cyclical. It's not considered linear. And So I was kind of intrigued when you said about the spherical time and that things are measured in cycles as opposed to linear in the Indian context. And I wanted to share that. Thank you for
Yeah.
bringing those 2 points up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I got to admit I don't know all that much about the Indian traditions. I think they're way too much to really know much about unless one kind of grows into them and out of them. I mean, just the experience I had with Indian musicians, for instance, is such a vastly different one from the ones I knew, right? The depth and level of complexity of the music, but still how, you know, there's a big difference between the classical music in Europe and that in India, because one is playing by heart and one is playing by sheet. And this aliveness that is so present in that culture is amazing to witness. And the little I do know, again, thanks to, in large parts, Alan Watts, is that I think the overall sense of time in the, I guess it's the Hindu tradition, but I might be wrong on that, is in terms of 4 cycles. I think there's one of them is called Kali Yuga, I think, and then there's a couple more. But I found it interesting that it's 4 of them, because again, we, you know, that could be, you know, could put them on this and say, okay, this is one, this is another. So at the same time, with this 4 eyes kind of frame, what I like about it, which is different from the 8 eyes, you know, another thing I didn't say about it is in the 8 eyes, you do have an eye for an eye. You know? There's always an eye on the other side of an eye, so we can look through this thing. Whereas on the 4 eyes, it's different because there's always a point on the other side of the eye. And if I had a different kind of model here, which I don't right now, I could just do what I think, Richard, it was part of your conversation recently, which kind of got the confusion in the language going so much, because was this going out or in, you know? And that's difficult to tell because it's on a flat plane, right? It's neither or both or whatever. And it's a matter of how people look at it. You know, it's the observer's eye that makes it so or the other. And it's a very special case, or a very special and unique quality of the 4 eyes, that it does not actually have an eye for an eye, but always a heart for an eye. So we can, if we do look at 4 terms, you know, we could identify them either as the 4 hearts or as the 4 eyes, because they are correlated, 1 eye for 1 heart. And that, I think, opens up a vast network of options of looking into these things. And I think that, and I'm just going to go back to this because Richard said it earlier as a matter of question, sort of how to do, you know, should we go into the flat to explain it, or shouldn't we, right? Should we go that model or that? I think the funny thing is we can go anywhere, and we can explain the whole from any point of view, but we can also go kind of to all kinds of ways, right? Rather than having a monologic, monocausal, let's go one model and that's the one that we take, we can actually go, as the universe does, omnidirectional, small steps everywhere, because every mistaken step is just a small one that we can take another one when we're not vastly invested into a single direction. And I would really, personally, I would not go to flatten synergetics out to make it more digestible to people. Because then we're moving into the framework that is at present, into the abstract, and try to communicate within that and say, look, here is something that, look, it points out, we can go out there. I would rather actually, if I do have the chance of engaging with someone, and in particular, if we're doing so in the presence of the bodies, as you do tell from your life experiences, where you brought models into these constellations, it's that beauty actually of it not being confined to the flatness, to the abstract, to the page, right? And if it does help someone to wrap their mind around the whole thing, if they first see something which is flat and then they go, okay, so this is that and this is that, and then it goes there, cool. That's why I do have a model that looks like that too, right? Because in some situation, it might be just the one to go to, just the one I need. But really, I personally, for a good reason, have grown so many of these kinds of structures, these straws and strings and beads and things, because they are the most alive of the ones that I have. They are the least hindered by their manufacturing, because I have no fixed connections. I don't have planes there that are, here is none of that. This is as flexible and as dynamic as the real thing, because it is the real thing. And the experience that this can give to people when they take a hold on it, when they open themselves to grasp it, is one that goes far, far beyond what we could reach in a purely abstract, or in even when we do get back into that namespace, so to speak, of the 2D.
No, I agree with you. And I think the one thing that a lot of us don't do is to have the models so you can see them move back and forth. And then at some point you will make the decision as to whether it's better to carry on, and if you want the flat version and the spatial or spherical version. But the audience has already experienced moving back and forth with the use of models like you have. One of the things that's interesting when you talked about hexagons is that when you put the triangles together into something like the Star of David, for example, the two triangles, one upright and the other sort of inverse, then you connect the edges and you've got a hexagon. And one of the things that happened to me when I was in India, because of, I won't go into the idea or where it came from, but it had to do with the openness and the appreciation of different kinds of spiritual beliefs and so forth. I got the idea that if I worked with those two triangles, like one triangle plus one triangle equals four triangles, that you can work those triangles in a way that you can put the triangles together in the tetrahedron, then you can rub off the edges, and you basically have the Christian cross. You put the two triangles together, like I just described, you get the Star of David, and you also get, in the same way, you get the Song of Solomon. And if you open the triangles up and put them together in the correct way, you get the Buddhist and the Hindu swastika. If you put them together in a way that you have the circle on the bottom and the cross in the middle, you have the indigenous medicine wheel. So what I was trying to get at is the idea that something in nature or something in universe, structurally speaking, is common to a lot of different manifestations. Yeah. And if we could understand that, then we may not be quite as antagonistic towards what appears to be a face different than mine. It may have just manifested itself in what appears to be different, but underneath is a common framework, such as the minimum whole system as an example. But it was a fun exercise to try and see whether or not there was that kind of commonality to the diversity of many religions. Then I looked at some other documentation and found that in religious symbols, in going way beyond sort of the so-called core religions, hexagons are predominant in terms of the symbolism that's being used to represent whatever that face is. That it's a fascinating sort of discovery that I've made in the last year or so.
Yeah. This is actually speaking to something that I've been feeling for a while now, which is that, you know, the kind of crux with the whole thing that we've been talking about today, the way that literature or literate mindset has negated the body, you know, erased the presence of the bodies. A sort of inverse of that, I don't know if it's better, but it kind of feels like perhaps bringing in a bit of balance in between them, is to think that, at least to my mind, I come to a place where more and more what is considered symbols are essentially patterns, structural patterns, dynamic patterns, put into a way where they seem to be at rest, right? Because they are drawn onto something. But I'm very much sure by now that, for instance, the sticker, the cat muted me, the swastika as a symbol before it became a symbol, I think in the minds of those who drew it was actually a very dynamic thing. You know, it was not static. It was not just the still lifeless lines they drew, but it was imbued with the dynamics of movement and turning and that way, right? So, for instance, you mentioned the Star of David. I have one lying down there, just out of reach. To me, that is an expression of the pattern of the kagome weave, the trihexagonal, triagonal weave that I use on so many things now, because it's just a way of weaving that is already structural, right? And here is a piece of cloth that I've woven on my loom, my hexagonal loom, which is such a kagome weave, where, looking at it, I don't know how clear it is on the video now, but this is all little hexagons between the triangles that the thread is going. So that's a way in which we can weave, where the so-called symbol actually becomes a dynamic pattern again, one that is structural. And at the same time, you mentioned the cross, you know, and I think it's a curious thing about the forest that it kind of has that notion, that perspective on it, right? Like, this seems to be a cross now. However, it's not, the two lines aren't intersecting as they're supposed to in the cross, right? In reality, there's always, they can't go through the same place at the same time. So they have to get close by one another. And if they do that, then there is essentially a relationship between them, which is identical to the one in the four eyes. So when I do have these two, like so, they can't get all the way through one another, then whatever their distance, their relationship is already opening up the structure. And in a similar way, you know, a regular kind of weave, which is two-directional, why is it anything at all is because that crossway weave is creating a very low order kind of structure out of 4 eyes that are present between the woven threads, right? And it's not as structurally sound as we could weave the thread if we went 3-directional, but it is nevertheless a way to create a real fabric with triangulation, even though we don't recognize the triangulation usually. And I think that's something you spoke to, which is very important, the recognition, right? Because the way we've been brought up with forms is one where in view of all the shapes and forms that are present, we never ever put the kind of weight or emphasis perhaps on the triangle as the one giving shape, right? So it's very easy to do things with materials and think there is no triangles present. Whereas one who has been introduced to the triangles may look at the whole thing and see it for its triangulation and recognize, okay, the fact that this box is here is because on that level of it, there is a kind of triangulation happening. And if it wasn't there, if that wasn't there, the box wouldn't be, right? So it's kind of going beyond the superficial perspective of the abstract where it's a shape and looking into how is this shape triangulated to be the shape, right? And to recognize the triangulation, to recognize we're walking as a triangle on the ground, we're holding onto things because it's triangular, we're seeing depth, hearing depth because of that, I think is simply adding to our experience and to our awareness, and not really in a way that goes against the other. It's going around the other. You know, we can integrate the other and envelope it and still live a good life in the presence of it, but we're not bound by it anymore. We're not limited by that.
If anybody else has any questions or comments, you can. Oh, Struppi, did you want to go say something else? Wait, I can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, Shrikant. I couldn't
Okay,
hear Struppi.
I wasn't saying anything.
Oh,
I just
okay.
wanted to ask you, Struppi, I wanted to ask you, are there any other comments you have about any of the meetups?
Yeah, let me think. I think there's a few that I thought about while listening in and watching, and probably too many. It's the kind of problem of watching the thing secondhand and not being able to just join in the conversation. But one thing that I would like to bring up is with regards to the conversation on precession, because there was a lot of talking about the bee and the flower. And I really wanted to just draw the attention, our attention, to the agency of the flower, right? Because it was a very bee-centered perspective. It was always the bee wants to get the honey, no, the nectar, and it doesn't mind taking up the pollen on the side, right, to pollinate the flowers. And my kind of sense was more, you know, here's the bee as one being of this large organism that we call the hive, where the entire thing is very much clearly living by the principles of the spheres of universe at play, right? It's all about dance and all about vibration to communicate information and so forth. And now let's consider the bee being interested in the nectar because it, you know, it's a good stuff to get energetic and then dance a bit about. You know, it's like drinking that good stuff, and then let's go for a dance and tell the others where to get it. And at the same time realizing that the organism of the beehive is only whole in the mutual arising with the organism of the flowers, the organisms of the flowers. We can only have one when the other is there too. We can't have one without the other. And then we can look at this whole interaction from the point of view of the flower as well, and think how curious, how wise of the flower that it knows that the easiest way to proliferate itself, to propagate and move beyond this presence as that one flower through the seeds and everything else into the presence of more flowers. The easiest way to do that isn't straightforward by saying, come bee, get my pollen, but it's by offering something here and knowing that if I put my request in this plane, in this angle to the bee, it doesn't mind taking care of my needs, because I am offering myself up for the bee to have a good time. I'm offering all the goods I can muster, all the smells and tastes that make the bee go, woo, and just because that is a gift that comes from my heart, the bee doesn't mind on a side note to take care of what is more important to me as the flower, right? And I think that's just a kind of point of balance, to not only focus in on what is the bee doing on the flower, because that's really one of the examples that Bucky brought up. That's why we are talking about it in this context. But I think it's very good also to practice shifting the point of focus, shifting the center that we're zeroing in on, to look at the whole constellation from a different point of view and consider that also as active, as an integral member of this relationship. So that's, I think, one kind of thought that I really wanted to add to that conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that a little bit if I could.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
One is that certainly from my perspective, it wasn't one way with the bee. It's always been, for me, the bee and the flower, and then the inference in the literature that says that the perpendicular sort of action or the process that goes to the next flower and drops the pollen and so forth is considered an inadvertent or consequence. When I've worked with it in the social sense, the bee is as a person, like say a helper person, and the flower is someone receiving some help, or it could be vice versa. And so they come together in their axis and they create motion that's perpendicular to that axis that moves to another place. Now, from what you've just said, I think there's an important sort of elaboration on what Fuller may have been talking about with procession, and maybe focusing only on the bee or primarily on the bee, to say it's a bee and a flower interaction. And if the flower is doing what you just said, then it means the flower knew that this action could happen. And so it's not inadvertent, it's intentional. And if the bee is aware of it in a certain kind of way, it also understands the intentionality of getting the good time out of the nectar, but going to the next flower looking for more nectar. But in the meantime, I'll drop off a little pollen at the same time, and everybody wins. So I think that's a nice elaboration on the procession metaphor using the bee and the flower and the nectar and the pollen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I agree. It's just broadening the perspective somewhat, you know, and it, from a humanimal point of view, it's very easy to look at the bee as the actor, you know, the active part in the relationship, because it's closer to our being, because it's an animal, and we recognize that as a closer kin than the plant.
Yeah,
but really, it's the same kin.
But also for me, in the social context, when you are working in a helper-helpee relationship, our culture has trained us to believe in the expert. In other words, so the expert is the bee in that sense, if you wanted to call it, and the expert determines the motion. But when you understand the dynamics of interaction, like a fishtail, you realize that it's the bee and the flower working together. And if they don't zigzag together, then the motion will not happen. So it won't happen in a dynamic kind of way. It might be happen in a forced push or pull way. But so yeah, very important that it's never one is better than the other. It's two that are dancing together to create that perpendicular motion to the next flower and the dropping of the pollen. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
More, you know, one is nothing without the other.
That's right.
I think is more important to recognize than is one or more than the other or above or whatever, because it's the prescription or description of this relationships in terms of a hierarchy of what is more or less important is bound to fail, because in such a complex system, the balance at play rests on both the big and the little things. And
that's why in the helping, it rests both on the helper and the person being helped. The person being helped, if it works, they end up getting something that they couldn't do all by themselves on that particular occasion. The helper gets something that they can't do without someone to help. They want to become the best helper there is. And if they aren't able to do that with somebody, then they can't achieve that goal. So that's the synergy of two things coming together to do something that neither one can achieve by themselves.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wow, that's been great.
Thank you. Struppi, any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts. It's beautiful to see Shrikant walk around in New York. And it's generally beautiful to just be among you. And I really hope that I know it's been good. It's been really good that we had this kind of longer interval, because our first couple sessions were very deep and very intense in a way. And it takes space-time to spin a few rounds for everyone to integrate the stuff and then, you know, come back together. And I still really would like to get more sense of what this kind of conversation has done for each of you. Like, how did it move you? How did it perhaps change your perspectives? And I just look forward to the next time.
Sorry to interrupt, but if Evanik or Rupali want to say what they think of Struppi's meetups, please go ahead and do that. What did you get from Struppi's meetups?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go really quick. I think when you demonstrate or play with the 4 eyes and the 8 eyes and all that, it helps me understand Bucky's concepts a little better, than I did before I started the meetups. I would have to say all the ones that I've participated with you on has helped me to understand the Bucky concepts that are talked about in other meetups, and how they're applicable to the world today. And it helps me when I'm sitting in the other meetups understand them deeper because of what you've demonstrated. So personally, thank you for that. So that's what I've been getting, a deeper understanding of Bucky. And it's not, when I say deep, it's not deep at all, but it's something I'm learning.
That's actually, I mean, sorry, I got a piece of orange in my teeth. I'm, I'm really, I love the fact that all of you are so humble all the time. Like, you really make a point of saying that you're all just beginners or embryos, and you don't have a. And I would really ask you, invite you to recognize that you have moved beyond beginning. You are in the middle of it, and this middle is moving with you. We're never going to get to the end. None of us is going to be the expert on this, but every one of us is already having a whole life, a whole integrity, a whole point of view to speak from and to relate this to. And since we are talking synergetics here, again, there is no need to put better or worse, to say one is more advanced than the other or so. We don't need to go into that kind of hierarchical sense when we're among one another. And I think that's a, in Bucky's world, it's clear when he was speaking to 9-year-olds as if they were professors, and to professors as if they were 9-year-olds, as the saying goes, because he met people were on a different level, not on. I think it's one of the Zen koans that says, what is the difference between high and low or so, and that goes, the long bamboo is the long body of Buddha, and the short bamboo is the short body of Buddha. They're all there to be, and to be whole, and to be held in the community of one another. And I think this gives us also, it allows us, it invites us to open ourselves to the grace and say, I don't need to be humble right now, I can be graceful. And I can grace our being together with my perspective, right? And I don't need to diminish it to begin with, to then go in. I can just be here with you among one another, meeting eye to
Struppi,
eye.
I want to call on Rupali if she's willing.
Mhm.
Rupali, she's my friend, and she started her career building geodesic domes with an architect in India. Rupali, would you like to comment on what you're getting from Struppi's meetups?
Yeah, I would say it's, the very playful sense of life that I really love the way, Struppi, you personify your shapes and shapes speak to you. It's very childlike, very innocent, and it's the playful nature of your talks. At the same time, they take us on a journey through different topics. So I absolutely enjoy listening to you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can I just make a quick comment about what Rapuli just said? And in that you started out as an architect. When I was in India in '94, and I was in Bangalore with hosts who brought another couple to dinner at a club in Bangalore, and I got into one of my bragging about I'm connected to Fuller's work and so forth and so on, and the guest's friend, he sort of cut in on it, and he said, well, I'm actually an architect, and I worked with Fuller on the New Delhi airport. So much for me trying to get the upper hand of having knowledge about Fuller. So, thank you for that opportunity to share that little story.
Thank you, Rich. Does anybody have anything else they want to add?
I just wanted to say, Struppi, I am honored that you were the one who started us on this series of meetups. I really appreciate your handiwork. I like the fact that you play with these things and you work with these things, because so you have a very grounded sense of all the ideas that you talk about. I also like the fact that you come up with names which you think capture the nature of things. I think that's crucial. That's what Bucky did himself. It's like, if you look at his writings. So I am, honored to have you participate and would love to have you back. So let's be in touch. We would love you to be a regular feature for this series. So that's all I wanted to say. So I just throw it to you, Struppi, for any final thoughts, and then we'll close up.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I would be, I'm absolutely happy to be around with you whenever, whenever it's okay. I would love to be with you every day. Honestly, I am. I'm listening to almost everything that you're doing anyways. But it means so much to me because I sense that what the living ideas cosmos, the living ideas sphere is growing is a radically new, I don't know if it's new, but it's a very called for sense of integration, from the hindsight at Bucky's world, at his life and what he had done through all the many eyes and hearts that have met him, who is still with us, who can share that. And also opening this up to people who may have never heard of it, and the kind of format that we have here where we're sharing these ideas and I can tell you a story or two about these things. I've been telling these stories to many people, but I think there is something unique about the way that we're doing it here. Because you are already such a well-structured organism when it comes to wrapping your minds around a topic. You have already created a culture between you of inviting the confluence of mind, the conspiratory, the breathing together of thoughts. And I feel like that is a great fertile ground, as if it was a mental garden for these tales and stories and reasonings to plant in and take root and then grow into something where more people from different backgrounds may come across it and get a very unique sense again, because it's not just their own sense, it's not just my own sense, it's our common sense that we're calling into presence with these meetups. And yeah, to look into that, I mean, just generally sharing sense and ideas is a great pleasure to me, and I feel a lot of resonance between us. So it's really beautiful that you do this and that you have invited us all in to share into it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Struppi, and say hi to your cat, and we'll see you soon, folks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.
Bye now.